Homeless at 20, she won a sealed storage unit of junk. One crate hit a fortune nobody saw coming. It was a choice born from the kind of desperation that lives in your bones, a cold that has nothing to do with the weather. And what I found inside that metal box wouldn't just change my life, it would rewrite the story of a family I never even knew I had. If you've ever felt like you were at the absolute end of your rope, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. This is for anyone who's ever had to find their own way home. The air in the auction hall had the stale, metallic taste of circulated dust and cheap coffee. It was a cavernous warehouse on the industrial edge of town, a place where forgotten things came to be sold to people who hoped to find treasure in someone else's tragedy. I was one of them, 20 years old, with exactly $257 to my name, folded into a worn crease in the pocket of my too-thin jacket. 200 of that was earmarked for the auction. The 57 was for the week ahead, or the month, or whatever I could stretch it into. When you're living out a backpack, you learn a strange and brutal kind of math. 2 years. It had been 2 years since I'd aged out of the foster care system, a process they call emancipation, which is a cruelly optimistic word for being handed a trash bag with your belongings and a list of shelters that are probably full. 2 years of couch surfing, of night shifts at diners that closed down, of sleeping in bus stations until a security guard would gently, or not so gently, tell you to move along. I wasn't just broke, I was worn down to the nub. My hope was a flickering pilot light, and the wind was picking up. That's why I was here. I'd seen a flyer tacked to a laundromat bulletin board, storage unit auction, cash only. The words had seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. People lose their storage units for all sorts of reasons. They forget, they move away, they die. And the contents, the accumulated stuff of a life, gets sold off to the highest bidder. Most of the time, it's junk. Boxes of holiday decorations, broken furniture, clothes that smell of mothballs and regret. But sometimes, just sometimes, there's something else. A box of old baseball cards, a piece of antique furniture, a forgotten safe. That's the dream that fuels these places. It was the only dream I had left. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a stained tie, was rattling through the lot numbers. Lot 17, we got a 10 by 10, looks like household goods. I see a sofa. I see some boxes. Who'll give me 50? $50. 50, do I hear 50? The regulars, a pack of grizzled men in work boots and a few sharp-eyed women, would bid with practiced ease, a flick of a finger, a slight nod of the head. They knew what they were looking for. I had no idea. I was just looking for a lifeline. The unit I had my eye on was the last one on the list, Lot 42. It was different. While the others were open for a 5-minute viewing from the doorway, this one was sealed. A thick, rusted padlock and a heavy chain were wrapped around the latch, supplemented by a red metal seal from the county sheriff's department. The auctioneer called it a lien unit, sealed due to legal entanglement. Contents unknown. He said it hadn't been opened in 15 years. The previous owner was listed as E. Vance, deceased. The facility couldn't get a court order to cut the lock for years because of some probate mess that had finally been cleared up. 15 years. A time capsule of someone else's life. The regulars grumbled. They liked to see what they were bidding on. A sealed unit was a gamble of the highest order. It could be empty. It could be full of hazardous waste. But to me, the mystery was the point. It felt like a lottery ticket, an unopened door. My whole life had been a series of doors closing, one after another. The idea of opening one, even one that led to a 10 by 20 metal box, felt like an act of rebellion. All right, folks, last one of the day. Lot 42. Bienvenue. Contents completely unknown. We're selling the unit and its contents as is, where is. You buy the lock, you buy the box, you buy whatever ghosts are rattling around in there. The auctioneer boomed, a little bit of theatrical flair in his voice. We're going to start the bidding at $100. Who's got 100 for the mystery box? Silence. The regulars shook their heads, stuffing their hands in their pockets. Too much risk. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. $100 was almost half of everything I had. If it was empty, I wouldn't eat for 2 weeks. $100? Anyone? Going once. I took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. My hand, thin and trembling slightly, went up. 100. I squeaked out. My voice was a ghost in the big room. The auctioneer's eyes found me in the back. He gave me a look, part pity, part curiosity. I got 100 from the young lady in the back. Do I hear 125? One of the regulars, a man with a thick neck and a grease-stained baseball cap, grunted. 110. He was trying to push me out, get it for cheap. My stomach twisted. I couldn't go much higher. 150, I said, my voice a little stronger this time. The number felt huge, monumental. It was rent. It was a month of groceries. It was a bus ticket to somewhere new. The man in the cap scoffed and shook his head, making a dismissive gesture. He was out. $150, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing slightly. Going once, going twice. Sold. To the young lady for $150. The gavel cracked, and the sound shot right through me. A wave of nausea and terror, and a tiny, insane spark of triumph washed over me. I owned it. I owned a sealed metal box. For a moment, I felt like I was going to throw up. I stumbled to the front office, my legs feeling like they were made of cotton. The woman behind the counter took my crumpled bills without a word, her expression bored. She handed me a receipt and a pair of bolt cutters. You've got 48 hours to clear out. Don't leave a mess. The facility manager, a tired-looking man named Al with a deeply lined face and kind eyes, walked me out. He'd been watching the auction from the office doorway. You new to this, kid? He asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed a long, weary sound. Lot 42. That one's been here since before I started. Eleanor Vance. Paid like clockwork for years, then just stopped. Mail returned, calls went unanswered. Took us forever to get it cleared for sale. Hope you find something good in there, but don't get your hopes up. Usually when they're sealed this long, it's because the family didn't want what was inside. He pointed down a long row of identical orange doors. It's all the way at the end. Good luck. The walk down that corridor felt like the longest walk of my life. The concrete was cold under my worn-out sneakers. The air smelled of dust and damp. Each orange door I passed felt like a judgment. Unit 34. Unit 36. Unit 38. The numbers were mocking me, counting down on my failure. What had I done? I'd spent almost all my money on a ghost closet. My hand was shaking so hard I could barely hold the bolt cutters. I reached Lot 42. The door was no different from the others, just a rectangle of faded orange steel, but the lock and chain gave it a sense of finality, of secrets purposefully kept. The red sheriff seal was brittle with age. I picked at a corner, and it flaked away into dust. This was a tomb. I was about to perform a desecration. The bolt cutters were heavy and awkward. I fumbled with them, trying to get the jaws around the thick shackle of the padlock. It took 3 tries, my weak arms straining against the tool. The first 2 times, the cutters just slipped off with a clang. I felt a hot flush of shame, imagining Al watching me on a security camera, shaking his head at the stupid kid. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and put all of my weight, all of my fear and desperation into that final squeeze. There was a loud, sharp snap that echoed in the quiet corridor. The padlock sprang open. The tension was gone. I unwound the heavy chain, its links leaving greasy rust marks on my hands. The final piece was the latch, a simple sliding mechanism. It was stiff from years of disuse. I had to put my shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. It finally gave way with a screech of protesting metal. For a long moment, I just stood there, my hand on the cold handle. The space beyond that door held my future. It was either a new beginning or the final, definitive end of the road. I pulled. The heavy roll-up door was surprisingly light, groaning upward on its tracks, letting out a puff of air that smelled like time itself. A dry, still, unbreathing scent of paper and fabric and dust. A 15-year-old breath. The light from the corridor sliced into the darkness, illuminating a wall of stuff. It was packed to the ceiling. My first feeling was a crushing, overwhelming wave of disappointment. It was exactly what the regulars had feared. It was junk. Cardboard boxes, sagging and brown with age, were stacked precariously. The shapes of old furniture were draped in yellowed sheets, looking like lumpy ghosts. A lampshade, tilted at a genre angle, sat atop one stack like a sad, forgotten hat. There was no clear path inside. It was a solid wall of possessions. I had 48 hours to clear it out. I didn't have a truck. I didn't have anywhere to put any of this. I didn't even have the money for a dumpster. I had bought myself a problem, an expensive 10 by 20 foot problem. I leaned against the cold metal of the doorframe, the bolt cutters hanging limply from my hand, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the hot sting of tears welling in my eyes. I didn't let them fall. Cry was a luxury I couldn't afford. Taking a shaky breath, I stepped over the threshold. The floor was concrete, coated in a fine layer of dust that puffed up around my shoes. The air was so still it felt thick, heavy in my lungs. I reached for the nearest box. The tape was dry and brittle, and it flaked away under my fingers. I lifted the flaps. Inside were old romance novels, their covers faded, their pages yellowed and smelling sweet with decay. I set it aside. The next box was full of chipped porcelain figurines, shepherdesses and rosy-cheeked children. Worthless. The one after that held a collection of mismatched, tarnished silverware. Hours passed. I worked in a kind of numb trance, pulling boxes down, opening them, and creating a small mountain of useless things in the corridor. There were clothes smelling of mothballs in styles from decades ago. There were stacks of old magazines, their pages stuck together. There was a box of ancient, expired canned goods. It was the portrait of a life, but a life that had been packed away and left to rot. There was nothing of value here. The $150 was gone. I was a fool. The sun began to set, and the corridor grew dim. The single bare bulb overhead cast long, distorted shadows. My back ached. My hands were black with grime. I was sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the mess I'd made, when my eyes caught something. Tucked away in the very back, behind a tower of boxes and an old, ugly floral sofa, was something that didn't fit. It wasn't a cardboard box. It was a dark green, military-style footlocker. A trunk. It was made of metal, with heavy-duty latches and reinforced corners. It looked solid. It looked important. A new jolt of energy, a flicker of that pilot light, went through me. It took me another hour to clear a path to it. I had to wrestle the musty old sofa out of the way, its springs groaning in protest. Finally, I could reach the trunk. I ran my hand over the cold, dusty metal. It was locked, not with a padlock, but with two built-in combination locks, their dials frozen with age and rust. I tried to lift it. It was incredibly heavy. It didn't rattle or shift. Whatever was inside was dense, packed tight. I dragged it, scraping and screeching, out of the unit and into the dim light of the corridor. I sat on the floor in front of it, my heart starting to pound again, that familiar, terrifying rhythm of hope. I didn't have the combination. I thought about Al, but I was too embarrassed to ask for help, to admit that my grand gamble had come down to a lockbox. I still had the bolt cutters. The locks were built in, but there was a hasp for a central padlock, which was missing. Maybe I could pry it. I took a screwdriver from a small toolkit I carried in my backpack and tried to jam it into the seam of the lid. The metal was too thick. It wouldn't budge. I was sweating now, my frustration mounting. I stood up and looked around the unit, desperate. In a box of old tools, I found a small crowbar. It felt heavy and powerful in my hand. This was it. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam near one of the latches and threw all my weight onto it. The metal groaned, bent, and then, with a deafening shriek and a crack, the latch broke. One side of the lid popped up by an inch. I did the same to the other side. Another crack, louder this time. The trunk was open. My hands were trembling again as I lifted the heavy lid. I was half expecting more junk, more disappointment. I was not prepared for what I saw. The top layer was just old, folded blankets, smelling of cedar. I pulled them out. Underneath them, my breath caught in my throat. It was money, bundles of cash, neatly wrapped in paper bands. Stacks and stacks of it. 50s and hundreds. More money than I had ever seen in my life. It wasn't just a few $1,000s. It looked like tens of thousands. Maybe more. I just stared, my mind unable to process it. It felt like a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. I reached out a trembling finger and touched one of the bundles. It was real. The paper was crisp. I sat there on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the junk of a dead woman's life, and I started to laugh. It was a wild, unhinged sound that bounced off the metal walls. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Then the laughter turned into sobs, hot and racking, that shook my whole body. I cried for the 2 years of being hungry and cold. I cried for the little girl in the foster home who just wanted a family. I cried for the sheer, impossible absurdity of this moment. After a long time, when the tears had subsided, I began to carefully lift the bundles of money out, stacking them beside me. My hands shook so badly I kept dropping them. Underneath all the cash, there was something else. A smaller, sealed metal box like a document safe. And on top of it, a thick, cream-colored envelope with a single word written on the front in elegant, looping cursive. Maya. My blood went cold. That's my name. It's not a common name. My breath hitched. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence. It had to be. With shaking fingers, I picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. The seal on the back was unbroken. A simple wax stamp with the initial E. Vance. Eleanor Vance. I didn't know anyone by that name. My mother, who had died when I was 6, had been an orphan herself, or so I'd been told. I had no family. No grandparents, no aunts, no uncles. I was completely and utterly alone. I broke the seal. Inside was a single, folded sheet of the same heavy paper. The ink was a faded blue. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, beautiful and precise. It began, "My dearest Maya." I read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. The dusty, quiet storage facility seemed to fall away, and all that existed was the letter in my hand. "If you are reading this," it said, "then I am gone, and a great many things have gone wrong. But one thing at least has gone right. You have found this. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am your grandmother." I read the line again, and again. Your grandmother. The words didn't make sense. They were like a key to a lock I didn't know existed. A grandmother. I had a grandmother. I had a family. The letter continued, and with every word, the story of my life, the one I had told myself for 14 years, was dismantled piece by piece. She wrote that she hadn't abandoned my mother. She had been forced to run. My grandfather, a man I never knew existed, was not a good person. She used softer words, charming but dangerous, a man with dark appetites, but the meaning was clear. He was involved in things, criminal things, and when my mother was born, Eleanor knew she had to get her away from him. So she ran, changed her name, and gave my mother up for adoption, believing it was the only way to keep her safe, to give her a chance at a normal life. She had hoped to come back for her one day, but my grandfather's reach was long. He never stopped looking for them. "I watched from a distance," she wrote. "I knew when she entered the foster system after you were born and she fell ill. I knew when she passed away. It is the greatest regret of my life that I could not be there, that I could not hold you and tell you that you were loved. Every choice I made to protect the two of you from man who would have destroyed you. This money, I saved it over a lifetime of quiet, lonely work. It was always for you. It was the only way I could give you the safety I could never give your mother." The letter ended with instructions. Inside the smaller metal box were documents. My original birth certificate, with her name on it, photographs, and journals. "They will tell you the rest of the story," she wrote. "The truth is a heavy inheritance, Maya, but it is yours. What you do with it, and with this money, is up to you. Live. Be happy. Be free. That is all I ever wanted." I sat there in the silence, the letter clutched in my hand, the world remade. I had a grandmother. Her name was Eleanor, and she had loved me. The money, the incredible pile of cash sitting next to me, suddenly felt secondary. The real treasure was this letter. It was a history. It was a route tethering me to something, to someone. I wasn't just a piece of driftwood anymore. I was the granddaughter of Eleanor Vance. The weight of it was immense. The grief for a woman I'd never met, for a mother I barely remembered, for a life that had been stolen from us all. But underneath the grief was a profound and powerful sense of connection. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. A secret guardian had been watching over me my whole life. I spent the night in that storage unit. I couldn't leave it. I couldn't leave her. I dragged the ugly floral sofa back inside, curled up on its musty cushions, and pulled one of the cedar-scented blankets over me. I kept the letter on my chest. I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark, in the quiet, surrounded by the ghost of her life, and I finally felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt safe. I felt like I was, in some strange way, finally home. This journey, though, was far from over. If you've ever discovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew, I want you to know this space is for you. Let me know in the comments if a story like this resonates, because sharing these things is how we realize we're not alone. The truth can be a heavy burden, but sometimes you have to carry it to find out who you really are. Now, let's get back to what happened next, because the money and the letters were just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold, the scent of dust and mothballs clinging to me. The reality of the situation came crashing back in. I had a fortune in a footlocker and a story that felt too big for my own head. My first instinct, the one honed by years of instability, was to run, take the money, get a bus ticket to the furthest possible city, and start a new life where no one knew me. It was the safe choice. It was what Eleanor had done. But her letter, it wasn't just a goodbye. It was a baton being passed. The truth is a heavy inheritance. I knew I couldn't just walk away from it. I needed to understand. I used the crowbar again, this time on the smaller document box. Inside, just as she'd said, were journals. 5 of them, bound in worn leather. There were photographs, too. A picture of a smiling young woman with my eyes, holding a baby, my mother and me. A picture of an older woman, her face kind but etched with a deep sadness, standing in front of a small, neat house. Eleanor. I spent the entire day right there on that concrete floor reading. Her journals were a revelation. They detailed her escape, the fear of being hunted, the quiet, lonely life she built for herself as a bookkeeper in a small town a few states away. She wrote about the pain of watching my mother's life from afar, of seeing her struggle. She wrote about me. She had followed my file through the foster care system, using a private investigator she paid with what little money she could spare. She knew which homes I'd been in. She knew when I'd run away. She knew when I'd aged out. She is resilient, she wrote in one entry, dated a week after my 18th birthday. She has my strength and her mother's heart. But the world is not kind to those who are alone. I pray this nest egg will be enough. I pray she finds it. The journals also painted a clearer picture of my grandfather, a man named Marcus Thorne. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a powerful, ruthless property developer who had built an empire on intimidation and shady deals. The land this very storage facility was built on, she revealed, had once belonged to her family, the Van Cess. It had been a small farm. Thorne had forced her father to sell it for pennies on the dollar before he married her, the first of many conquests. He had taken everything from her, piece by piece. As I was reading the last journal, my world still reeling, I heard footsteps in the corridor. It was Al, the manager. He stopped at the entrance to my unit, looking at the mess of boxes and the trunk sitting in the middle of the floor. "Making progress, I see," he said, his eyes scanning the scene. He didn't look angry about the mess, just observant. "You staying in here, kid?" I flushed with embarrassment. "No, I just fell asleep." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the open footlocker. He didn't say anything about the bundles of cash I'd hastily covered with a blanket, but I knew he'd seen them. "Look," he said, his voice lowering, "I'm not going to ask any questions, but you should be careful. A girl on her own with whatever you found in there. People notice things." He then handed me a folded piece of paper. "This came for this unit. It was posted on the main office door. Figured you should have it." I took the paper. It was a formal legal notice, a letter of intent from a company called Thorne Development Group. My blood ran cold. The notice stated that the entire property had been purchased and was slated for demolition in 60 days to make way for a new luxury condominium complex. All tenants were required to vacate their units within 30 days. Thorne Development Group. It couldn't be a coincidence. My grandfather. He was coming back to finish the job, to erase the last piece of Vance land from the map. And I was standing right in the middle of it. The old instinct screamed at me again. Run. Take the money and disappear. It's what Eleanor would have wanted, right? For me to be safe? I looked at the letter, then at the journal in my lap, and my grandmother's steady, determined handwriting. She had spent her entire life running, hiding, surviving. She had done it to protect her family. But now, the threat wasn't a man. It was a corporation, a piece of paper, a legal notice. The fight was different. And I was different. I wasn't just a homeless kid anymore. I was Eleanor Vance's granddaughter. I had her story. And thanks to her, I had resources. Running felt like a betrayal. It felt like letting him win again. He had taken her home, taken her daughter, and shadowed her entire life. He would not take this last piece of her from me. In that moment, a decision crystallized in my mind, hard and clear as glass. I wasn't going to run. I was going to stay. I was going to fight. Al, I said, my voice shaking but firm. Do you know a lawyer? He looked at me, a long, appraising look. A flicker of something, respect, maybe, passed through his tired eyes. Yeah, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. I think I might. The first step was to secure the money. I'll help me. He drove me to 3 different banks in his beat-up pickup truck, and I opened 3 separate accounts, depositing 1/3 of the cash in each. The bank tellers looked at me, this grimy kid in torn jeans, with suspicion, but the money was real, and that's all they ultimately cared about. I kept a few thousand in cash, enough for the immediate future. The feeling of that debit card in my wallet was surreal. It was a key to a world that had always been locked to me. The second step was a place to live. I found a small, furnished apartment for rent by the week. It was nothing fancy, just a room with a bed, a small kitchenette, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. But to me, it was a palace. The first night there, I took the longest, hottest shower of my life, letting the grime and the dust and the fear wash down the drain. I slept for 12 hours straight in a real bed, the journals and the letter on the nightstand beside me. The lawyer Al recommended was a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She was young, sharp, and seemed to run on coffee and a fierce sense of justice. Her office was a cluttered room above a pizza shop. I told her everything. I showed her the journals, the birth certificate, the notice from Thorn Development Group. I expected her to be skeptical, but she just listened, her expression intense, occasionally jotting down notes. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is a lot," she said, blowing out a breath. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, and your grandfather is a piece of work. I've heard his name. Marcus Thorn has been swallowing up property in this city for 30 years, often in legally questionable ways. Can we fight it?" I asked, my voice small. The demolition. Sarah steepled her fingers. Fighting a development corporation with deep pockets is an uphill battle, a very steep one. They have teams of lawyers. But, she said, a glint in her eye, your grandmother's journals might be our slingshot. They're not just a personal history, they're a record. She documented how Thorn originally acquired this land from your great-grandfather. If we can prove coercion or fraud in the original sale, we might be able to file an injunction to challenge their title to the property. Hope, real and fragile, bloomed in my chest. So if there's a chance, there's always a chance, she said. It won't be fast, and it won't be cheap, but you have the resources to start the fight. The question is, are you ready for it? They will dig into your life. They will try to discredit you, to paint you as an opportunist. I thought of Eleanor, living her life in the shadows. I thought of the ugly floral sofa and the blanket that had kept me warm. I'm ready, I said. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Sarah filed the initial motions. We started digging, hiring a private investigator, just like Eleanor had, to look into Thorn Development's past deals. I moved everything out of the storage unit, renting a new, clean one in a different part of town. I kept the trunk, of course, and a few other things, a box of Eleanor's books, the chipped porcelain figurines, the ugly floral sofa. They felt like artifacts, pieces of my newfound history. I also started to build a life. I bought new clothes that fit. I ate 3 meals a day. I even bought a laptop and started taking online courses, catching up on the education I'd missed. But the fight was the center of my world. The developers responded to our lawsuit with a dismissive motion to quash, calling our claims frivolous and the desperate fantasy of a troubled young woman. Their lawyers were sleek and expensive, the kind you see in movies. In court, they looked right through me, as if I were a piece of furniture. It was hard not to let their words get to me. The self-doubt that had been my constant companion for years whispered in my ear. Who was I to take on a man like Marcus Thorne? I was just a foster kid who got lucky. But then I would read Eleanor's journals. I would read about her courage, her quiet defiance. She had spent a lifetime saving that money, not just for me to survive, but for me to have a choice. And I was choosing to fight for her. We needed more than just the journals. We needed public support. Sarah suggested we try to find other families who had been pushed out by Thorne over the years. We put out ads online and in the local paper. The response was slow at first, a trickle of hesitant emails. But then one story led to another. We found an elderly couple whose family business had been forced out by a sudden, inexplicable 500% rent increase. We found a community of artists who had been evicted from a warehouse district Thorne wanted for luxury lofts. Their stories were all different, but they had one thing in common: the shadow of Marcus Thorne. I decided to do something that terrified me. I started a small community group, the Vance Project, named for my grandmother. We met in a rented church basement. At the first meeting, only 5 people showed up. I stood in front of them, my hands shaking, and told them my story. I told them about Eleanor, about the storage unit, about the land. I told them we had a chance to stand up to a bully who had been running this town for too long. Slowly, week by week, the group grew. The local news picked up the story. Mysterious heiress challenges city's biggest developer. They painted me as some kind of folk hero, which felt strange and uncomfortable. I wasn't a hero. I was just a granddaughter trying to honor a promise I'd never gotten to make. The fight was far from over. The legal battle would drag on for months, maybe years. But for the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. I had a community. I had a purpose. One afternoon, I went back to the old storage facility. The demolition had been delayed by our injunction, but the place was a ghost town, all the units empty except for mine, which was now just a shell. I stood in the doorway of Lot 42 and looked at the empty concrete space. It was just a box. But for me, it had been a sanctuary, a tomb, and a treasure chest. It was the place where I had died and been reborn. I realized then that Eleanor's inheritance wasn't just the money or the journals. It was the fight itself. She had given me a reason to stop running and start building. Home isn't just a place you live. It's a place you stand your ground for. It's the community you build, the history you reclaim, the future you fight to protect. The ugly floral sofa was now in my small apartment. Sometimes I still slept on it, just to remember where I came from. It was a strange, lumpy, beautiful inheritance, and I was finally strong enough to carry it. Looking back on it all now, the lesson is so clear. The things we inherit from our families are so much more than money or property. We inherit their stories, their struggles, their quiet acts of courage. We inherit their unfinished business. And sometimes, the greatest gift they can give us is a chance to finish the fight they couldn't. My grandmother, Eleanor, spent her life in the shadows so that one day I could step into the light. The fortune she left me wasn't in the cash. It was in the choice she gave me. The choice to be more than a survivor. The choice to be a protector, a builder, a voice for those who have been silenced. This journey taught me that you can find a home in the most unexpected of places, in a dusty storage unit, in the pages of an old journal, in a room full of strangers who share your fight. It taught me that your past doesn't have to define your future, but understanding it can give you the map you need to navigate it. The legal battle with Thorne Development is still ongoing, but we've won some small victories. We've brought a community together. We've shown a light on the dark corners of this city. Whatever happens, we have already changed things. And that brings me back to you. I share this story not just to tell you what happened to me, but to connect with you. So many of us carry hidden histories, stories of loss and resilience that we think no one else would understand. This channel is a place for those stories. It's a community built on the idea that our pasts matter and our voices deserve to be heard. So if you made it this far, thank you. If my story about finding a hidden legacy in a place of abandonment resonated with you, I want you to do two things. First, hit that subscribe button and join our community. We share stories like this every week. Stories about second chances, hidden truths, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. Second, I want you to leave a comment below. What does the word inheritance mean to you? It doesn't have to be about money. It could be a lesson from a grandparent, a skill from a parent, or a story that has been passed down in your family. I read every single comment, and I believe your stories matter just as much as mine. You are not alone in your fight, and you are not alone in your hope. Thank you for listening.